They thought the fire would hide their crime. A baby girl locked in a burning room, her cries muffled by smoke, and a German shepherd who refused to let the flames win. A former army firefighter trained to run toward danger, now facing a betrayal far darker than war. What happened next will make you cry and believe in justice again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe no innocent should suffer, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. The wind in Cedar Hollow carried the bite of January across the Montana highlands, crisp and dry, laced with the faint resin of pine that bordered the narrow two-lane roads. The town itself was a patchwork of snow-crusted rooftops and sagging porches, a place where everyone knew who had missed Sunday service and whose chimney smoke meant bread was in the oven. That afternoon, the sun hung low, a pale coin in a sky already bruising toward twilight, and the air crackled with the kind of cold that burned in the lungs. Noah Carter sat behind the wheel of his battered silver pickup, the kind of truck whose dents carried stories no one else remembered. At 32, he had the steady build of a man who had spent years fighting fires in both forests and cities, his frame broad-shouldered, his posture a blend of military discipline and the slower caution of someone who'd seen too many unpredictable turns. His face, weathered by sun and wind, bore the faint shadow of stubble. His eyes were a deep gray blue, watchful and tired. He had just completed a grueling 2-month refresher program for Army Reserve firefighters, returning not to a base, but to the place he'd grown up. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Ranger. 9 years old now, the German shepherd was a powerful, dark-limbed shadow with a coat of black and warm rust brown, the fur at his ruff thick like winter armor. His right flank carried a pale scar, faint but impossible to miss in the right light, a reminder of a house fire 3 years ago when, as a younger dog, he had broken through a collapsing door to drag out a boy too shocked to move. That boy, standing by an ambulance with soot on his cheeks, had whispered, "You're my Ranger," likening the dog to the heroes in the books his grandfather read him. The name stuck, and for Noah, it became more than a name. It was a badge of the dog's unflinching loyalty and quiet courage. Ranger's eyes were the molten amber of a campfire's heart, and like his handler, he watched the road ahead with an intensity that suggested he never really stopped working. The pickup rattled along the frost-heaved asphalt, the hum of the engine mixing with the faint jangle of tags on Ranger's collar. The plan for the evening was simple. Stop at Noah's mother's place for stew, maybe bring in more wood for her stove, and try to let the months of drills and smoke fade for just one night. But halfway down the long slope toward the west end of town, something jarred Noah out of the rhythm of the drive. Far ahead, at the base of a wooded rise where the road bent past a cluster of older homes, a column of thick black smoke stabbed upward into the pale sky, twisting like a rope pulling the clouds down. Black smoke wasn't wood stove smoke. It was oil, plastic, roofing tar things that meant trouble. Noah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That's not right," he murmured, more to himself than to Ranger, but the shepherd's ears pricked at his tone. Without hesitation, Noah pressed the gas, the old pickup leaping forward in protest before settling into the push. As they drew closer, the sound of shouting bled through the still winter air. Urgent, panicked voices echoing off snowbanks. Then a sharper cry from an older woman's throat cut through. "There's still a baby inside!" The house came into view, a single-story log-frame home with a caved-in section of roof toward the back. Flames licked the edges of the garage, racing along the eaves, and windows belched thick smoke into the icy air. Several neighbors were clustered in the yard, some with garden hoses spraying futile streams against the fire's hunger. At the edge of the group stood Donna Kramer, a wiry woman in her 70s known for her sharp tongue and sharper pies, her silver hair coiled tightly under a knitted cap. Her mittened hands were clutched at her chest, her face pale and lined deeper by fear. Noah didn't slow to ask questions. He braked hard, flung the door open, and was already moving when Ranger vaulted down beside him. "Garage is going," someone yelled. "Door's stuck!" But Noah's eyes were already on the front entry paint blistered, frame darkening with heat. He lunged at it shoulder first. It gave a shudder, opened an inch, then jammed. He stepped back, swung the butt of his crowbar from the truck into the hinges. Metal screamed, wood splintered, and the door swung wide. Heat slapped him like a living thing, and the air seared his throat. Smoke boiled in, curling low, and the sharp chemical bite of burning insulation mingled with something else, something acrid and out of place. Noah registered it but filed it away for later. "Ranger with me!" he called, and the dog slipped past his legs, keeping low, moving with the precision of long practice. The hallway beyond was a tunnel of shadow and flickering orange. Embers hissed and spat from the ceiling, dropping sparks across the warped floorboards. Somewhere ahead, a faint, thin wail carried through the roar of the fire. Noah followed it to a white-painted door at the hall's end. The handle was hot, locked. One hard kick shattered the latch, and they burst into a room already hazy with smoke. Against the far wall, a crib loomed like a fragile island, and inside, a baby girl, no more than 10 months, flushed red from the heat, tiny hands flailing weakly. All right, I've got you," Noah murmured, scooping her into one arm, shielding her face with his coat. Ranger moved closer, positioning himself under the sagging ceiling beam just as it groaned. A charred plank broke loose, tumbling toward them, but the shepherd leapt, his shoulders slamming it aside. Noah didn't stop to think, just bent low and sprinted back down the hall, the weight of the child warm against his chest, Ranger close enough that Noah could feel the brush of his fur. The front door blazed into view ahead, and then they were through it, into the shock of cold air and the sharp sting of daylight on smoke-reddened eyes. Neighbors surged forward. A woman in a headscarf reached for the baby, cradling her with whispered reassurances. Donna stood trembling, lips moving in a prayer. Noah bent over, gulping air, sweat and soot streaking his face. Behind him, the roof groaned, flames clawing skyward. Ranger stood in the snow at the porch's edge, chest heaving, but his nose was lifted, not toward the cheering relief of the crowd, but toward the doorway they'd just left. His ears twitched, and he stepped forward, sniffing hard. Then his head lowered, and his paw scraped at the scorched threshold, claws catching on charred wood. Noah recognized the signal. The dog had caught something. The smell was there again, petrol, sharp and alien under the blanket of burning resin and melted vinyl. Ranger's amber eyes flicked up to Noah's, steady and certain. This wasn't just a fire. By the time the fire trucks pulled away, night had settled like a dark shawl over Cedar Hollow. Snow flurries drifted lazily in the cold air, each flake glinting in the yellow wash of the remaining emergency lights. The house still smoldered, its walls sagging inward, blackened beams hissing in the cold as they surrendered their last heat. Noah stood a few yards away with Ranger, the dog's chest still rising hard, his fur flecked with soot. The crowd had thinned, but the voices that remained carried a new toneless panic, more speculation. A name passed from mouth to mouth. Sandra Ruiz. Sandra was the Coleman's neighbor and the baby's regular caretaker, a woman in her late 60s with a sturdy frame, thick silver hair pinned under a knitted beret, and a face lined in a way that spoke of decades under the Montana sun. She'd been known for her cinnamon rolls at church bake sales and for shoveling the sidewalk for the elderly couple across the street without being asked. Tonight, though, the warmth usually in her brown eyes was gone, replaced by something pinched and guarded. She stood near the edge of the police tape, shoulders hunched against the cold, clutching a long wool coat tightly around her. Several townsfolk were casting glances her way, some pitying, others sharp-edged. "Word is she ran off when the fire started," someone muttered behind Noah. He turned just enough to catch the speaker, a man in a camo cap with a face reddened by wind and whiskey. "Left the baby in there." Noah's jaw tightened. He didn't know Sandra well, but he knew gossip in a small town could burn just as hot as any fire and often left longer scars. He looked down at Ranger, who sat with his ears pricked forward, gaze locked on the house. The shepherd rose without prompting, padding back toward the charred porch, ignoring the tape. "Ranger," Noah called, but the dog kept going, his nose low, weaving slightly like a needle, threading a scent. Deputy Alma Reed noticed. She had arrived minutes earlier, a tall, willowy woman in her mid-30s with a long winter parka over her duty uniform, her auburn hair tied back in a practical knot. Alma had a calm presence that could steady a crowd, but she was also known for being methodical to a fault. She crouched beside Ranger as he sniffed along the edge of the porch. "He's on something," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. Her gray-green eyes flicked to Noah. "Mind if I let him work?" Noah nodded. Alma stepped back, and Ranger nosed his way toward the side of the house. There, the garage door hung warped, one corner melted where the flames had licked it. The dog's movements grew more intent, head dipping, nostrils flaring. He paused near the threshold, then angled toward a small crack in the siding where the wall had buckled. Alma knelt again, sniffing the air herself. "Gasoline," she murmured, her tone flat but certain. "Not from the vehicles either. This is raw fuel." Noah's thoughts went back to the smell he'd caught inside, masked beneath the smoke. He and Alma both turned to look at the blackened shape of the house. "Electrical accident, huh?" Noah said quietly. Alma didn't answer, just straightened and pulled a small notebook from her pocket, jotting something down before walking back toward her cruiser. Inside the crime scene perimeter, an investigator from the county short, thick around the middle, with the expression of a man who preferred his desk to the cold was cataloging debris with a flashlight. Noah asked if he could look at the hallway where he'd found Ivy. The man shrugged, clearly not thrilled about letting a civilian in, but Alma's slight nod gave permission. The beam of Noah's headlamp swept over the warped floorboards and blistered paint. He stopped at the nursery doorframe. The hinges were scorched but intact, the knob blackened. He ran his fingers over the outer edge. Fresh gouges scored the metal plate where a latch had once bitten deep. The scratches were sharp, clean. They hadn't been there long enough to gather dust before the fire. The lock itself, still bolted in place, had been forced from the outside. He stared at it for a moment, his mind reconstructing the angle, the pressure. Whoever locked that door had meant to keep someone in, not out. From the street, church bells tolled, once soft, distant. Noah glanced through the broken window toward the steeple in the town square. A figure in a dark coat moved toward the church steps, head bent against the wind. It was Pastor Glenn, the town's longtime shepherd of souls, a man in his late 50s with a deep, resonant voice and a build that still hinted at the high school quarterback he once was. Glenn's black overcoat flared in the wind as he reached the landing where Maggie Coleman stood waiting. Maggie was in her early 30s, her nurse's scrubs visible beneath a borrowed coat, her chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid. Her face was drawn tight with exhaustion and fear, and she held herself as though bracing for another blow. Glenn's large hands closed around hers, drawing her into an embrace that seemed to fold her against the cold and the uncertainty both. From where he stood, Noah couldn't hear the words, but he could read the rhythm: comfort, faith, hold on. Across the yard, Sandra lingered, clearly watching the scene at the church steps. Her breath plumed white in the cold as she adjusted her coat, her chin lifting slightly as though trying to will herself into steadiness. Two women passed by and murmured to each other, their eyes sliding toward Sandra in a way that made Noah's teeth clench. Ranger, sensing his handler's tension, returned to his side, leaning his weight into Noah's leg in quiet solidarity. By the time Noah left the property, Alma was speaking to another officer, her breath curling in the light from her cruiser's headlamps. "Preliminary call is still accidental," she said as Noah passed, "but I'm not filing that without a second look." Her tone suggested she already knew the first look hadn't been good enough. Noah opened the truck's door for Ranger, the shepherd hopping in with a grace that belied his size. As Noah slid behind the wheel, he glanced once more at the ruin of the house, at the huddled figures of the townsfolk, and at Sandra standing apart, her breath fogging the air. He'd fought enough fires to know that sometimes the real damage didn't come from the flames, but from the silence that followed them. By the time the fire trucks pulled away, night had settled like a dark shawl over Cedar Hollow. Snow flurries drifted lazily in the cold air, each flake glinting in the yellow wash of the remaining emergency lights. The house still smoldered, its walls sagging inward, blackened beams hissing in the cold as they surrendered their last heat. Noah stood a few yards away with Ranger, the dog's chest still rising hard, his fur flecked with soot. The crowd had thinned, but the voices that remained carried a new toneless panic, more speculation. A name passed from mouth to mouth: Sandra Ruiz. Sandra was the Coleman's neighbor and the baby's regular caretaker, a woman in her late 60s with a sturdy frame, thick silver hair pinned under a knitted beret, and a face lined in a way that spoke of decades under the Montana sun. She'd been known for her cinnamon rolls at church bake sales and for shoveling the sidewalk for the elderly couple across the street without being asked. Tonight, though, the warmth usually in her brown eyes was gone, replaced by something pinched and guarded. She stood near the edge of the police tape, shoulders hunched against the cold, clutching a long wool coat tightly around her. Several townsfolk were casting glances her way, some pitying, others sharp-edged. Word is she ran off when the fire started, someone muttered behind Noah. He turned just enough to catch the speaker, a man in a camo cap with a face reddened by wind and whiskey. Left the baby in there. Noah's jaw tightened. He didn't know Sandra well, but he knew gossip in a small town could burn just as hot as any fire, and often left longer scars. He looked down at Ranger, who sat with his ears pricked forward, gaze locked on the house. The shepherd rose without prompting, padding back toward the charred porch, ignoring the tape. "Ranger," Noah called, but the dog kept going, his nose low, weaving slightly like a needle threading a scent. Deputy Alma Reed noticed. She had arrived minutes earlier, a tall, willowy woman in her mid-30s with a long winter parka over her duty uniform, her auburn hair tied back in a practical knot. Alma had a calm presence that could steady a crowd, but she was also known for being methodical to a fault. She crouched beside Ranger as he sniffed along the edge of the porch. "He's on something," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. Her gray-green eyes flicked to Noah. "Mind if I let him work?" Noah nodded. Alma stepped back and Ranger nosed his way toward the side of the house. There the garage door hung warped, one corner melted where the flames had licked it. The dog's movements grew more intent, head dipping, nostrils flaring. He paused near the threshold, then angled toward a small crack in the siding where the wall had buckled. Alma knelt again, sniffing the air herself. "Gasoline," she murmured, her tone flat but certain. "Not from the vehicles either. This is raw fuel." Noah's thoughts went back to the smell he'd caught inside, masked beneath the smoke. He and Alma both turned to look at the blackened shape of the house. "Electrical accident, huh?" Noah said quietly. Alma didn't answer, just straightened and pulled a small notebook from her pocket, jotting something down before walking back toward her cruiser. Inside the crime scene perimeter, an investigator from the county short, thick around the middle, with the expression of a man who preferred his desk to the cold, was cataloging debris with a flashlight. Noah asked if he could look at the hallway where he'd found Ivy. The man shrugged, clearly not thrilled about letting a civilian in, but Alma's slight nod gave permission. The beam of Noah's headlamp swept over the warped floorboards and blistered paint. He stopped at the nursery doorframe. The hinges were scorched but intact, the knob blackened. He ran his fingers over the outer edge. Fresh gouges scored the metal plate where a latch had once bitten deep. The scratches were sharp, clean. They hadn't been there long enough to gather dust before the fire. The lock itself, still bolted in place, had been forced from the outside. He stared at it for a moment, his mind reconstructing the angle, the pressure. Whoever locked that door had meant to keep someone in, not out. From the street, church bells tolled, once soft, distant. Noah glanced through the broken window toward the steeple in the town square. A figure in a dark coat moved toward the church steps, head bent against the wind. It was Pastor Glenn, the town's longtime shepherd of souls, a man in his late 50s with a deep, resonant voice and a build that still hinted at the high school quarterback he once was. Glenn's black overcoat flared in the wind as he reached the landing, where Maggie Coleman stood waiting. Maggie was in her early 30s, her nurse's scrubs visible beneath a borrowed coat, her chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid. Her face was drawn tight with exhaustion and fear, and she held herself as though bracing for another blow. Glenn's large hands closed around hers, drawing her into an embrace that seemed to fold her against the cold and the uncertainty both. From where he stood, Noah couldn't hear the words, but he could read the rhythm. Comfort, faith, hold on. Across the yard, Sandra lingered, clearly watching the scene at the church steps. Her breath plumed white in the cold as she adjusted her coat, her chin lifting slightly as though trying to will herself into steadiness. Two women passed by and murmured to each other, their eyes sliding toward Sandra in a way that made Noah's teeth clench. Ranger, sensing his handler's tension, returned to his side, leaning his weight into Noah's leg in quiet solidarity. By the time Noah left the property, Alma was speaking to another officer, her breath curling in the light from her cruiser's headlamps. "Preliminary call is still accidental," she said as Noah passed. "But I'm not filing that without a second look." Her tone suggested she already knew the first look hadn't been good enough. Noah opened the truck's door for Ranger, the shepherd hopping in with a grace that belied his size. As Noah slid behind the wheel, he glanced once more at the ruin of the house, at the huddled figures of the townsfolk, and at Sandra standing apart, her breath fogging the air. He'd fought enough fires to know that sometimes the real damage didn't come from the flames, but from the silence that followed them. The midday sun was little more than a dim silver disk over Cedar Hollow, its light dulled by the low blanket of cloud that promised more snow by nightfall. Main Street was quiet, the sound of boots on packed snow muffled under the hiss of wind funneling between the buildings. Noah pulled his pickup into a narrow side lot beside a two-story brick building with faded lettering over the door, Coleman & Sons Construction. This was the family business temporarily under the stewardship of Wesley Park while Earl Coleman lay in the county rehab center recovering from his fall. Noah had known Wesley since they were both lanky teenagers fixing fences for extra cash. Wesley had grown into a thick-set man in his early 40s with heavy shoulders and a jawline buried under a neatly trimmed beard. He dressed well for a man in construction-pressed flannel shirts, jeans that looked new, boots that never seemed to gather much dirt. His easy smile had earned him a reputation as someone who could get things done, though the older generation remembered him as quick to cut corners. The reception area smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust. Behind the desk sat a young man with sandy hair and round glasses, no older than 24. His name tag read, Caleb Dyer. He had the narrow build of someone more accustomed to a desk than a job site, his posture slightly hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Caleb looked up from a ledger when Noah stepped inside, eyes flicking to Ranger, who padded in with his nails clicking softly on the linoleum. "Can I help you?" Caleb asked, voice cautious. "I was hoping to see Wesley," Noah replied. "He's out at the Miller site, won't be back for a couple of hours." Caleb's voice lowered. "If you're here about the accounts, you should probably know this." He hesitated, then glanced toward the glass-paneled office door as if afraid it might swing open. "There have been some withdrawals, big ones, since Mr. Coleman's accident, all signed off by Wesley, cash, no receipts, no project entries." He pushed a sheet across the desk. It was a printout from the accounting system. Dates, amounts, and a signature column with Wesley's name repeated in blocky strokes. The numbers were eye-catching: $5,000 here, $7,500 there, every week or so, for nearly 3 months. Noah studied it without expression. "Any chance this was for materials?" Caleb shook his head. "I track all that, and if it was for subcontractors, I'd have invoices. But there's nothing. It's like the money just walked out the door." Before Noah could ask more, Ranger's head turned toward the back of the building. The dog's ears angled forward, and he padded away, nails tapping on the concrete as he disappeared through a doorway marked storage. Noah followed, the smell of cold cement and motor oil growing stronger. The storage bay was dim, lit only by a single bulb overhead. Stacks of lumber, pallets of cinder blocks, and bins of hardware lined the walls. Ranger nosed the floor near a corner where the concrete was stained darker than the rest. He sniffed intently, tail low, then glanced back at Noah with a sharp huff. Noah crouched, placing his hand on the cold slab. There it was, faint but distinct, the same acrid tang of gasoline he'd smelled at the Coleman house. "You get fuel stored in here?" Noah asked when Caleb appeared in the doorway. Caleb frowned. "Not since last summer. We keep the tanks at the yard out by the highway now. Less fire risk." Noah straightened, his mind already running through the implications. The scent was faint, not recent, but it matched too well to be coincidence. Someone had handled gasoline here, and likely the same person who'd been near the Coleman home the night of the fire. Later that afternoon, as Noah drove back through town, his phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from Alma Reed. "Check your email. Got something you'll want to see." At his kitchen table, with Ranger curled at his feet, Noah opened the message. Alma had forwarded an email with no sender name, only an untraceable address. The message was short. "Thought you'd need this." Attached was a still image from a gas station security camera. The timestamp was from the evening of the fire. In grainy black and white, a man in a dark beanie hat was loading a red gas can into the bed of a dark-colored pickup. Snow and mud streaked the sides, and the license plate was smeared over in a crust of frozen slush. Noah leaned closer, his jaw tightening. The angle of the shoulders, the bulk of the coat, it was hard to be certain, but something about the man's stance scratched at his memory. Ranger, sensing the shift in his mood, lifted his head and rested his chin on Noah's knee. Whoever had sent the email wanted this seen, and Noah was starting to think that whoever set the fire hadn't just wanted to destroy a home. They might have been burning more than wood. Snow swirled over the back roads leading out of Cedar Hollow, the flakes chasing each other in a restless dance against the windshield. Noah guided the pickup carefully, the wipers squeaking in rhythm, while Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears pivoting at every sound outside. It was late afternoon, but the light was already fading to that blue-gray dimness that came before a heavy night's snow. They were headed toward Sandra Ruiz's small clapboard house at the edge of town. Sandra met them at the door, bundled in a heavy wool sweater, her hair loosely tied back, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Inside, the place smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke. The living room was neat but lived in, family photos on the wall, crocheted blankets draped over the couch, and a stack of children's books by the armrest. She motioned for them to sit, though her hands fidgeted as if unsure whether she wanted to talk at all. "It's been going around that I left her in there," she began, her voice wavering. "But that's not how it happened." She poured tea into mismatched mugs, the steam curling in the cold air that seeped from the old windows. The evening of the fire, Wesley stopped by, said he needed to borrow Earl's banking records, something about clarifying the payroll for a project. She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't think much of it. I've known him for years. He told me to go make tea while he looked in the study." Her gaze shifted toward the kitchen doorway. Ivy had been fussy, so I picked her up, carried her down the hall to the nursery, thinking the quiet might help her settle. I laid her in the crib, and then I heard it. She lifted her hand, miming a slow turn of a key. A click. Not from the crib, but from the hallway side of the door. Her voice cracked. When I tried the knob, it wouldn't turn. I called out, but he didn't answer. A minute later, I heard the front door close. Then the smoke alarm started. Noah leaned forward, studying her expression. The detail about the key matched what he'd seen on the doorframe, the clean, deliberate damage to the lock from outside. Alma, who had come with him, was taking notes with brisk efficiency, but her eyes lifted to meet Noah's in a way that told him she was beginning to see the same picture. Ranger, who had been lying at Noah's feet, suddenly lifted his head, sniffing toward the open window. His nose twitched, and then he stood, padding toward the door. Noah recognized the behavior Ranger had picked up something. "Where's he going?" Sandra asked. "Following a lead," Noah said, already rising. Alma closed her notebook and followed them outside into the deepening cold. Ranger led them back to the truck, then along the narrow lane toward the heart of town. They passed shuttered shops and the dark windows of the library, finally stopping at the chain-link fence surrounding the municipal waste yard. Inside, the yard was quiet except for the distant hum of a compactor. The gate stood open. A man in an orange reflective vest waved them through after Alma flashed her badge. His name tag read Donnie Ricks, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a grizzled beard and a voice like gravel. "Be careful where you step," he advised. "Snow's covering the ice underfoot." Ranger made a beeline for a row of large metal barrels used for scrap metal disposal. He stopped in front of one, paws braced on the rim as he sniffed inside. Noah leaned over and saw it. A charred mass of twisted metal, blackened on one side but with flecks of white paint clinging stubbornly to the other. He reached in with a gloved hand and pulled it out, a lock assembly, the type you'd find on an interior door. The paint was identical to the white enamel on Ivy's nursery door. "Looks like someone didn't want this lying around," Alma said grimly, snapping photos with her phone. Donnie scratched his beard. "That went in last night, came in with a bin from the south side. Couldn't tell you who dumped it. We get a dozen loads in an evening when the weather's decent." As they left the yard, the street lamps were flickering on, casting cones of pale gold onto the snow. Across the street, the church doors opened, and Pastor Glenn emerged with Sandra at his side. She clutched a folded blanket in her arms, her cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. A few townsfolk were handing her bags of groceries. Another passed her a pair of knitted mittens. Glenn's large hand rested on her shoulder, steadying her as she spoke to each person in turn. "Word travels fast here," Alma said quietly as they watched. "Looks like the tide's turning." Noah nodded but kept his eyes on Sandra. She was smiling faintly now, the wariness in her posture easing. Still, the memory of her voice describing the turn of that key stayed with him. A door locked from the outside, a lock now found half-burned in a trash barrel. Pieces of a puzzle that was starting to take shape, one with Wesley Park's shadow growing darker over it by the hour. The wind had sharpened into icy knives by the time Alma's call came through. She had arranged for Wesley Park to come down to the station to clear up a few questions, but when she arrived at the agreed time, the lobby chair sat empty. "He's gone," she said over the phone, her tone clipped. Didn't even make it to town. His truck's missing too. Noah was already pulling on his coat. By nightfall, Cedar Hollow was blanketed in darkness, the only light spilling from porch lamps and the occasional glow of a distant window. Snow dusted the roads in fine, salt-like crystals, swirling in the beam of Noah's headlights. Ranger sat taut in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed ahead. Alma's cruiser was just ahead of them, red and blue lights off to avoid giving away their approach. They met at the edge of a service road that cut into the pine forest. Alma stepped out, a scarf pulled high over her mouth, her breath forming clouds in the beam of her flashlight. Fresh tire tracks, she said, pointing to the parallel ruts pressed deep into the snow. Headed west, away from the highway. Ranger was already down, nose pressed to the ground, moving with deliberate certainty. Let him lead, Noah said, falling into step beside Alma as the dog followed the tracks into the forest. The air between the trees was stiller, the snow muffling their steps. The pines crowded close, their branches heavy with frost, and in the silence Noah could hear the faint creak of ice shifting somewhere ahead. They broke out of the tree line onto the east approach of Bitter River Bridge, a narrow, century-old wooden span that crossed the slow, black water of the river. Tonight the surface was sheathed in a thin layer of ice that groaned under the weight of the wind. On the far side, Wesley's dark pickup was parked at an angle, one wheel already edging dangerously close to the icy riverbank. Wesley was out of the cab, his broad frame hunched against the cold. The light from a small camping lantern at his feet threw his features into sharp relief, the heavy brow drawn tight, jaw clenched, eyes darting toward the woods like a trapped animal. In one hand, he held a battered red gas can, the other fumbled with a cheap plastic lighter. Noah's voice cut through the wind. "Wesley!" Wesley jerked, looking over his shoulder. "Stay back!" His voice was hoarse, carrying the tremor of a man who knew the walls were closing in. "You don't know what you're messing with." He crouched, splashing fuel along the base of his truck, the acrid smell hitting them even from several yards away. Ranger surged forward, the leash slipping from Noah's glove. Snow flew from under the shepherd's paws as he closed the distance in seconds. Wesley had just thumbed the lighter open when Ranger barreled into his leg, the force knocking the lighter from his grasp and sending it skittering across the icy planks. Noah was there an instant later, hitting Wesley hard enough to send them both sliding. The two men wrestled briefly before Noah got a knee into Wesley's side and rolled him onto his stomach. Alma moved in, snapping a pair of cuffs over his wrists with a practiced efficiency. "You're done, Wesley," she said flatly. The truck gave a sharp groan as its front right wheel broke more of the ice crust along the riverbank. "It's going in," Alma said. She sprinted to her cruiser, pulling a winch cable from the front. Noah grabbed the hook and secured it to the truck's undercarriage, the freezing metal biting into his fingers through the gloves. Alma reversed slowly, the cable tightening until the truck was anchored firmly to the bridge rail. With Wesley cuffed and seated in the back of the cruiser, Alma opened the truck's passenger door to make sure there was nothing dangerous inside. A leather briefcase sat on the seat. She unlatched it and pulled out a neat stack of documents bound with a rubber band. Bank withdrawal slips, receipts for bulk gasoline purchases, and a single brass key on a worn keychain. She held it up, the lamplight catching its jagged teeth. "Spare for the Coleman garage," she murmured. The bridge creaked under a new gust of wind, snow whipping sideways across its span. Wesley sat sullen and silent in the back seat, eyes fixed on the floor. Ranger stood beside Noah, chest still heaving from the run, his breath fogging the cold air. The shepherd's eyes stayed locked on Wesley's reflection in the glass, unblinking. They drove back toward town in convoy, the forest receding into shadow behind them. The Bitter River Bridge disappeared into the storm as if it had never been there, but the image of Wesley on its span gas can in hand, lies closing in around him, would stay burned in Noah's mind long after the snow buried their tracks. The courthouse in Cedar Hollow was an imposing sandstone building, its steps swept clear of the snow that had been falling on and off all week. Inside, the air was warm but tense, the hum of hushed conversation filling the high-ceilinged chamber. Wooden benches were packed with townsfolk neighbors, business owners, and church members, drawn by the promise of resolution to a fire that had divided the community. At the prosecution table, Alma Reed sat beside the county's lead prosecutor, Henry Mathers, a man in his mid-50s with thinning dark hair, deep-set hazel eyes, and a reputation for his meticulous, almost theatrical delivery in court. Across from them, Wesley Park sat stiff in a dark suit that didn't quite fit, his beard trimmed but his expression flat. His defense attorney, Carl Denton, was a younger man with slick black hair and a restless energy, his gaze constantly scanning the jury for any flicker of doubt. Noah sat in the second row behind the prosecution, Ranger stretched out at his feet. The German Shepherd's coat was brushed to a soft sheen, his amber eyes calm but watchful. His presence had been cleared by the judge, a tall, no-nonsense woman named Judge Irene Calloway, whose silver bob and sharp cheekbones gave her an air of unshakable authority. She had a reputation for running an orderly courtroom and an intolerance for theatrics. The prosecution began with the video. The lights dimmed, and on the large screen, the grainy footage from the gas station security camera flickered to life. A man in a dark beanie loading a red gas can into the bed of a dark pickup, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The timestamp matched the evening of the fire. Though the plate was obscured, the cracked taillight matched the witness statement from Laura Jensen. Next came the photos from the Coleman garage close-ups of the dark stains on the concrete floor, test results confirming gasoline residue. Then the charred lock from the town dump, still bearing flecks of white enamel identical to Ivy's nursery door. And finally, the bank records. Transaction after transaction of cash withdrawals, all signed by Wesley, coinciding with the weeks Earl Coleman had been in the hospital. Carl Denton rose smoothly when it was his turn, pacing before the jury with deliberate slowness. Ladies and gentlemen, I remind you, suspicion is not proof. My client admits to borrowing money from the business ill-advised, perhaps, but not to setting a fire. And the lock? He gestured toward the evidence table. There's no proof he placed it there. This could just as easily be a desperate attempt by someone else to cover their own mistakes. Someone with access to the house, someone like Sandra Ruiz. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sandra, sitting between Maggie Coleman and Pastor Glenn, stiffened. Maggie's hand went to hers, squeezing hard, but her face was pale. Henry Mathers stood. Your Honor, the defense is speculating without evidence. Judge Calloway's gavel rapped once. Sustained. Stick to the facts, Mr. Denton. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Leonard Price, a scent detection specialist from the state's K-9 unit program. He was in his early 60s, tall and lean, with a sun-weathered face and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades working with dogs. He described in precise terms how scent particles traveled and how a trained dog could follow them even after fire damage. He nodded toward Ranger, who sat alert at Noah's side. This animal's handler reported that he alerted consistently at the Coleman garage, matching the path of gasoline residue identified by lab analysis. This is known as corroborative detection. It's the same principle we use in criminal investigations statewide. Denton tried to undermine the testimony, suggesting dogs could be mistaken or influenced by their handlers. Dr. Price remained composed. In this case, the handler was not informed of the precise location of the residue before the alert. That eliminates cueing. The dog's alert is consistent with the physical evidence gathered independently. From her seat, Maggie's eyes brimmed as she looked at Sandra, the truth settling like a weight, but also a release. When closing arguments ended and the jury filed out, the room buzzed with low voices and shifting feet. Ranger's head rested against Noah's knee, the steady warmth grounding him in the long wait. It took the jury less than 2 hours to return. The foreman, a gray-haired mechanic named Tom Alvarez, stood and read the verdict. On the charge of arson in the first degree guilty, on the charge of destruction of evidence guilty, on the charge of reckless endangerment of a child guilty. Judge Calloway's voice was clear and unwavering as she pronounced the sentence, 22 years in state prison. This court finds the crimes committed to be deliberate, dangerous, and without regard for human life. Her gavel came down with a sharp crack. The gallery erupted, some in relieved murmurs, others in quiet gasps. Maggie turned to Sandra, her face streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. Pastor Glenn stepped forward, resting a hand on both their shoulders, his head bowed in prayer that seemed to draw the attention of half the room. Wesley was led out in cuffs, his expression unreadable, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Noah and Ranger. If there was anger there, it was muted under the inevitability of what had just happened. As the courtroom emptied, Alma stopped beside Noah, her breath visible in the cool hallway air. "We got him," she said simply. Ranger stood between them, tail flicking once before settling again. The thaw came late to Cedar Hollow that year, but by mid-March the snow was finally retreating in uneven patches, revealing brown grass and the dark, damp soil beneath. Where the Coleman house had once stood charred and skeletal, the sound of hammers and saws now filled the air. Framing rose against a sky the color of porcelain, and the smell of fresh-cut pine replaced the acrid memory of smoke. Earl Coleman stood at the edge of the lot, leaning on a carved wooden cane. At 71, he was still a large man, his shoulders broad under a plaid jacket, but the limp from his accident slowed his steps. His weather-lined face softened as he watched the crew work. Beside him, Maggie balanced Ivy on her hip. The little girl's cheeks were rosy, her fine hair catching the sunlight. Ivy giggled suddenly, her eyes locking on something over Maggie's shoulder. It was Ranger, trotting in with Noah at his side. The German shepherd's tail was already wagging, his gait loose and easy as he crossed the dirt to greet the toddler. Ivy reached for him, squealing, and Ranger nuzzled her with practiced gentleness, his warm breath puffing against her tiny fingers. Maggie laughed. "He's the only one who can make her forget nap time," she said. The rebuilding wasn't just for the Colemans. The fire had left a mark on the whole town, and people were eager to see something good come of it. That was how the Ranger Fund was born, a community trust to help victims of house fires and to train search and rescue dogs for Cedar Hollow and surrounding counties. At the dedication ceremony in the town square, Pastor Glenn spoke about the night of the fire and how courage came not only from people but from the animals who worked alongside them. He rested a hand on Ranger's head as Noah accepted a framed certificate naming the shepherd as the fund's first honorary guardian. Noah, for his part, was still learning to carry the weight of his own history. Years ago, as a young Army firefighter, he had lost a man in a barracks blaze, someone he had almost reached before a beam collapsed. That failure had settled deep in his bones, an ember that flared every time he smelled smoke. Standing on the rebuilt lot now, with Ranger's steady presence at his side and Ivy's laughter cutting through the air, he felt something in him loosen. The voice that had whispered, "You should have done more," was finally quieting. 2 weeks later, Alma Reed organized a town-wide fire safety day at the high school gym. Tables were set up with pamphlets, fire extinguisher demonstrations, and smoke alarm giveaways. But the highlight was a live demonstration led by Noah and Ranger. The gym lights dimmed, and a haze machine filled the air with harmless, scented smoke. Alma's voice rang out over the PA. "We're going to show you what to do if you ever wake up to smoke in your home." Noah dropped to his knees, showing the children how to crawl low to avoid the worst of the fumes, one hand keeping contact with the wall. Ranger followed, moving smoothly at his side. The children gasped when the shepherd stopped abruptly at a hidden door in the mock wall, barking twice the signal that he had found an exit. "Stay low, follow the dog, and you'll find your way out," Noah explained as they emerged into clear air. The applause came in waves, but the loudest were the cheers of the youngest kids, their mitten-sized hands clapping until their palms must have stung. Ivy, perched in Maggie's lap in the front row, clapped too, though her eyes never left Ranger. Afterward, parents came up to thank Alma and Noah, some asking how to apply for smoke alarms through the fund, others just wanting to pet the dog that had saved a life. Ranger accepted the attention with quiet dignity, his tail sweeping slowly back and forth. That evening, as Noah walked home through streets still edged with melting snow, he realized the cold in his chest wasn't from the wind. It was the fading of something heavy, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Ranger padded along beside him, their shadows stretching ahead under the street lamps, and for the first time in a long while, the night felt safe. 18 winters had come and gone since the night of the fire, but Cedar Hollow still woke on Sundays to the same rhythm, the toll of the church bell rolling over rooftops, the smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys, and the long shadows of pines cast across snow-blanketed streets. That morning, the snow was new and powdery, soft as sifted flour underfoot, the sky a pale silver that promised more before nightfall. Noah sat at his kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. His hair had gone mostly silver, his face lined deeper by years but softened by something else, peace. Across from him, on a thick rug by the stove, lay Ranger. The German shepherd was 19 now, his once powerful frame a little leaner, his muzzle frosted white, but his amber eyes still held the same steady light. He watched Noah the way he always had, as though nothing important could happen unless they both saw it. A knock came at the door, brisk but not hurried. When Noah opened it, the postal carrier, a cheerful woman named Marla Keene, handed him a small brown package. Marla was in her early 40s with a round face that seemed to carry the echo of a smile even in serious moments. "Special delivery," she said, her voice slightly muffled behind a knitted scarf. No return address, but it looked personal. Noah carried it inside and set it on the table. The handwriting on the label was careful, almost formal, as if the writer had practiced before committing to ink. Inside the package was a small box wrapped in plain paper. Beneath the lid lay a delicate silver bracelet, the kind given to a baby, its tiny clasp worn smooth with time. Tucked beside it was a folded letter, written in a hand both steady and warm. He unfolded it slowly. Dear Uncle Noah and Ranger, 18 years ago, you carried me out of the dark. You didn't know who I would become, but you gave me the chance to find out. Today I learned I've been accepted into the nursing program at St. Luke's. I want to help people the way you helped me. I hope I make you proud. Ivy. Noah read it twice, his vision blurring at the edges. He glanced toward Ranger, who had lifted his head, watching him with the quiet awareness of old companions. You hear that, old boy? Noah's voice was low, carrying the ghost of a laugh. We did all right. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head on Noah's knee, the heat of him seeping through the wool of Noah's trousers. Later that morning, the bells of Cedar Hollow rang out again, not in warning, but in celebration. The townsfolk had gathered for the winter service, a tradition that had survived snowstorms, blackouts, and once, a flood. The air outside was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but the church itself glowed with warmth from both the wood stove and the crowd inside. Pastor Glenn stood at the pulpit. He was well into his 70s now, his hair gone completely white, his frame a little stooped, but his voice still carried the steady, resonant timbre that could quiet a restless room. He spoke of faith, of resilience, of the strange ways grace found its path into people's lives. Then he looked toward Noah and Ranger, who sat together near the front, and smiled. 18 years ago, Glenn said, I watched this dog and this man walk out of a burning house carrying a life in their arms. Today, that life is grown, strong, and ready to serve others. Miracles, he paused, letting the word rest in the air, sometimes come on 4 legs. Outside, after the service, neighbors lingered in small knots, their breath rising like pale smoke. Snow fell again in lazy flakes, settling on hats and coats. Maggie was there, older but still quick to smile, her eyes bright with pride as she spoke of Ivy's news. Earl, leaning on a cane, told the story of the fire for what must have been the 100th time, but each telling seemed to smooth a little more of the pain. Noah stood a little apart, one gloved hand resting on Ranger's back, feeling the slow, even rise and fall of his breath. The shepherd's eyes followed the people moving in and out of the churchyard, then drifted upward toward the falling snow, as if memorizing it. The world was quieter now, gentler, and for Noah that was enough. When they finally turned toward home, their footprints lay side by side in the untouched snow, leading away from the church bell's steady toll and back toward the warmth of the small house where, once upon a time, a package on a winter morning had reminded him that saving one life could ripple out for decades. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not sudden flashes of light from the heavens, but steady footsteps in the snow, the hand that reaches for you in the dark, the loyal friend who refuses to let go, the quiet strength God places in the hearts of those willing to act. In Noah's story and in Ranger's steadfast courage, we are reminded that God often works through ordinary people and even through his creatures, guiding them to be at the right place, at the right time, for the right purpose. In our own lives, we may never run into a burning house or pull someone from the smoke, but every day, God gives us chances to bring light into someone's darkness, a kind word, a helping hand, a prayer spoken for someone who feels forgotten. These moments may seem small, but in God's plan, they can ripple farther than we will ever know. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others so they too can be reminded that miracles still walk among us. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more true and inspiring stories, and let us join in praying for God's blessing over everyone watching this. And if you believe that God still sends his angels sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, type amen in the comments and let your faith shine.